on? Okay. Well, good evening everyone. My name is Paul Hunter and I've got a little bit of experience with electric vehicles. I've converted 2 cars to run on electricity from batteries, and I now drive a commercially manufactured EV. 10-15 years ago, I guess if you'd have spoken to any of my friends, they would have said, Paul, he's a petrol head. I've had a lot of cars. I'd say I've had over 100 cars. I think that would qualify as a petrol head, yeah. Now if you speak to any of my friends, they'd say he's like a battery head or a volt head, because I've completely changed, I've gone electric. It was an interesting journey. A number of years ago, I was sitting at my desk. I worked for a large energy company, and this was at lunchtime, of course. And I was Googling cars, as I often did, and I saw something about an electric vehicle, and it caught my eye. And I thought, what? Electric cars? That's 2030, isn't it? Is that actually available now? And I had a look, and it brought me to this DVD here, Who Killed the Electric Car? And I thought, who killed it? I've never even seen one. So I actually purchased the DVD, got it sent from the US to my home here in Adelaide. It wouldn't work on my DVD player, so I sent to the US and got a US DVD player that worked, and watched this film. If you haven't seen this film, you've got to see this film. Those of you who've seen it know exactly what I'm talking about. Quite a while ago in the 90s, General Motors developed this fabulous little car, the 2-seater GM EV1. Great little car. I've got a book which I'm reading at the moment called The Car That Could, or The Little Car That Could. It's a bit like The Little Engine That Could, but it's The Little Car That Could. And it talks about some of the test drives that they did, and they got up to 200 miles out of a charge, so over 300 kilometers on a charge. Now, that wasn't a test track, but it just shows you what they were doing in, that was in about 1996. And what a fabulous car it was. GM leased it to a whole bunch of people, and then, guess what they did? They took them all back and crushed them. I was, no way, like, this technology, how could they do that? I was actually really upset with GM, and I said I will never buy another GM car unless it's electric. And so I thought, right, well, I'll build my own. This is back in around 2009, somewhere around there. And again, I was Googling all things electric vehicles, and I came across the Australian Electric Vehicle Association. And I saw the website and I thought, wow, I've got to get along to some of their meetings. And I came along to where we were back in the old days in town, and met some of the guys who were in the middle of their project, some of them had converted cars. I met a guy called Bruce who'd built a Suzuki Mighty Boy, and he said to me, Paul, he said, come down to my place tomorrow if you're not doing anything, come and have a test drive of it. I thought, yes. So I went down to Bruce's place down near Glenelg, and I drove this little Suzuki Mighty Boy. Now I'm 6'1", and my knees were like this, but I had a smile on my face, because seriously, I drove along the road and it was just quiet. No vibrations. You stop at the traffic lights, no vibrations, anything. So I loved it, and I thought, right, I've got to do my own project. So I thought, ideally I'd love a Tesla, but my bank balance didn't quite come to Tesla funds. So I thought, right, I'll get something small, something light, something that I can work on as a project. So I bought myself a little 1992 Suzuki Swift GTI, and for a very short while it had a 1300 twin-cam 16-valve engine in it. I actually looked for some of the photographs of my Swift GTI, and I've lost most of them. They're on a disc somewhere in my house, but I've moved 3 times since I did the conversion, so I don't know where they are. So I've only got a handful of the conversion that I did on the Swift, but I've got lots on the next car that I did. So I pulled the engine out, pulled the back seats out, put 45 lithium-ion batteries in. I think they were the Sky Energy batteries back then. Put a battery monitoring system on, put a charger on. That's the electric motor. I actually used, in that car, an 11-inch motor, which is quite reasonable. The wires you see there were just for testing. They're not the actual thickness of the cable that I used, I assure you of that. But as you can see, it's pretty basic. You've got the gearbox on the right-hand side. There we go, so we've got the gearbox here. And then this thing here, right, that plate is something that I made up to attach the gearbox to the motor. And then inside there, in between there, There's like a little piece that attaches the gearbox shaft to the shaft of the motor, because that's one of the trickiest parts. And then of course just at this end, I put together a bracket just to stop the thing falling off, and that just attached it to the original engine mount. But I'll show you in a bit more detail what I did with my Lotus later on. But it's pretty basic. That's what it looked like when it was finished. Back in those days you could buy a Zilla controller, which was quite a high-powered controller in its day. You could draw about 1,000 amps. So that little Suzuki Swift, I used to put it in third gear, and I could put my foot down, and it would wheel spin in third gear from a standing start. It was not a slow car, and I actually did that on purpose. I built a car that I wanted to go well, so that it wasn't considered slow by any means, but it was great fun to drive. Then one day, when I was working for the energy company, I was doing some deals with ChargePoint in Sydney. And we flew over to Sydney, and we had a chat with the guys down at ChargePoint, and they said to us after the meeting, "We've got a surprise for you." Okay, yeah, sounds good. So let's go outside. Went outside, and there was a Tesla Roadster sitting there. Threw me the keys and said, "Take it for a spin." I'm like, fantastic. So that's why I'm so happy. Says on the side here, it does 0 to 100 in 3.7 seconds. I did test it just to make sure they weren't lying, and it really does. It flew. I absolutely fanged it, and I was just amazed. Absolutely brilliant car to drive. So I had to have one, but I couldn't afford one, so I didn't steal one. Instead, I thought I'd build my own. So I stretched my budget as far as any budget could ever be stretched, and I bought myself a little Lotus Elise. I went up to the Gold Coast and brought that thing back. It was absolutely brilliant. I drove it to work for 2 or 3 weeks just to make sure there was nothing wrong with it, to make sure that it didn't have any faults in the gearbox or anything major, and it didn't. It was a perfect little car. That was my son, who's a lot bigger than that now. But you can see how small the car is. You know, he's bigger than the car at 8. It probably was. Although this did have reasonable legroom in it. So, there it is with its South Australian plates on. So, for those of you who, I think some of the visitors here tonight said you were looking at building an electric car, there's a lot of information in here that will help you. When you're building an electric car, when you're converting one to run on batteries and electric motor, there's a few things you've got to do. Before you can pull it apart, take it down to a weigh station. There's a weigh station on Marion Road. Get it weighed with a full tank of fuel, so you can actually show on the report. It's part of the things you need to do to get it through Regency for the inspection. So I got mine weighed. I then went all around and checked the height of the car, because when you add those batteries to it, you want to make sure that it's sitting at about the right height so that it's not going to affect the handling, especially on that car. Then it went into my garage on a set of ramps and a set of jack stands at the back, and I started stripping it apart. So, you know, all the exhaust came off. Do you like the number plate? Plug in. So I got the number plate reserved, got that on it already before it was even registered as an electric car. The 1.8 Lotus engine, which is actually a Rover K series engine, and you can see you've got a really small little boot. But I wanted to keep the boot because the roof comes off, and the roof folds up, and then you can put it in the boot. And I wanted to do that, so I didn't want to fill the boot full of batteries. The good thing about a Lotus is the whole back end comes off. As you can see here, I just stored it in my garage, and that's what it looks like without the back end off. Only about 15 bolts, which makes it a lot easier to get to the engine. So exhaust off, next thing, engine out. Reasonably good access. And it was about this point my wife walked into the garage and saw that, and she just looked at me. You saw what it looked like before. She looked at that and she went, "What have you done?" And I'm like, "It'll be all right. It'll be okay. I did it with the Suzuki. I'll do it with the Lotus." But I was thinking, how am I going to do it? Because it's one of those things you know the basics, but the actual doing it, where am I going to put the batteries? You work that out as you're going along, especially on a car that's got not really a lot of storage space. So that's what it looks like with the engine out. That's what it looks like with the seats out. That's on the inside looking back. You've got this little window and a little firewall. Underneath the car, Lotus put a reasonable size, about 45 litre fuel tank. And that's where it fits. That's looking up underneath the car. That's the fuel tank, which works very well for holding batteries. And I worked out you could get 10 batteries in there fantastic, nice low down weight, slip it up underneath. The only bad thing is you can't see the BMS or the little LEDs from the battery monitoring system once it's under there. But it was a good spot for it and I didn't really have much choice. Then the next thing to do was to get that engine, pull off the gearbox, because I can't have them together, so I had to strip that. Next thing was to start pulling the flywheel, the clutch plate in the middle, because I used the clutch plate. I think most people use the clutch plate when they do a conversion. I certainly did. The first time I did it, so you need that bit there. Okay? The clutch is a bit worn anyway. It's probably due for a change. But on my first Suzuki Swift conversion, I just used the very centre, and I used a welding hub, and I welded it onto a hub with a shaft that fitted onto the motor. So that way it was quite easy to attach the electric motor and the gearbox together. Because of the cost of the car and the fact that I wanted it to be absolutely spot on and as factory as I could possibly make it, I actually sent, well, I'll show you in a second what I sent off to an engineer. But there's your shaft coming out the gearbox. So you've got a spline on there, which is the same as this piece on the clutch, like so. Then you've got the electric motor. I used a 13-inch Kostov. Maybe overkill, but you don't want a car that looks that fast to go slowly, so I thought let's get a big motor. The shaft on here has to fit into the motor, into the gearbox. So I sought the services of Ray Hammett from Hammett Engineering, who's on Marion Road. Found him to be a really great guy who knows his stuff, and he made this coupler for me. So he started off with a 13 kilo piece of aluminium, steel, and machined it into this. So that end there fits the electric motor perfectly. And then if you turn it upside down, it's got a little dish, and the centre of the clutch, remember what I was talking about with the spline? That fits in the other side. Okay. Now the reason I left the clutch in this time with all these springs, last time I didn't have the springs, I just kept the middle. But when you put your foot down, it was a bit of a bang. It was a bit of a, there was no give, it was just boom, on. So this time I thought, right, I need that little bit of give, little bit of flex. So I actually left the centre of the clutch, and those springs just absorbed that shock, and it was a really smooth transition. Even when you put your foot down, it just seemed to really be smooth. So that's the way I did that. So that's how I attached the shaft from the gearbox to the shaft on the electric motor. But then you've got to make sure that the housing of the gearbox fits with the housing of the electric motor. So a 44 kilo piece of steel, very carefully machined into a beautiful adapter plate. Put the two together. That fits onto the electric motor and bolts through. And there you can see, so we've got the electric motor, the adapter plate, and then the actual coupler in the middle there. And if all's been measured properly, which it was, it would fit on there beautifully. So you've got your electric motor, your coupler, your adapter plate, and the gearbox. That's the hardest bit. So the first car, I did it myself. I literally used an angle grinder and a welder and a grinder. But yeah, this time I actually got it all engineered and outsourced. The batteries arrived. I actually used 45 Thunder Sky batteries, 100 ampere batteries each. Then it was a case of, right, where am I actually going to fit these batteries? So I know I can get 10 in the fuel compartment, but where am I going to put the rest of them? So it really was just a case of trial and error. And the first way around is putting them horizontal like that. And then I thought, well, maybe I could get a row in this back little boot section here, and that would still leave me just enough room for my roof if I want to take the roof off. And then it's a case of you've got to start building a battery frame and putting these things together. The engineer who I spoke to, Stuart Crozer, I would definitely recommend him. I find him to be very good with my conversions. He was talking about making everything with triangles because there's strength in triangles. So when you're building your battery box, bear that in mind. Oh, and it's worth getting an engineer at the beginning as well. Somebody like Stuart will actually come out, have a look at the project, and make some suggestions for you, even with regards to weight balance and things like that. So it was well worth it for the project because mine went through Regency first time and passed, and these guys were all over it with torches and everything. So as you can see, the central battery box is here. I'll put that in just behind the seats. And that's what it looks like from the back. The good thing about the lease is you've got this sort of like little cage, and it fitted in there properly. Even before I bolted it in, it wasn't going to go anywhere. Then I had to build some little brackets here and bolt them through the main part of the frame. The engineer then recommended that I attach it at the front here, and recommended that I use these special plates. They actually use these for harnesses, so if you go racing, if you're a member of CAMS or something like that, you can get these harness holders, and they go underneath, and then the bolt goes through, and he said if it's got that on it with rounded edges, he'll approve that, so that's what we did. Then you need to kind of work out, well, all right, sort of that motor and gearbox went in, must have been 20 times, in and out, because you're measuring things and you're trying to work out where will my batteries go, where's everything else going to go. And so it eventually went in with the batteries. That's the proper cabling, that's more like the thickness of the cabling you need. And what I decided was I'd have all these batteries here, the 10 batteries underneath, and then another 10 batteries or so here at the back, and that worked well, and it gave me enough room for the little boot space just to put a few things in. The back of the car went on and off again about 20 times, just trying to work out all the dimensions. That's what the battery box looked like underneath. That's the old petrol tank after I'd finished it, and that's got the battery monitoring system on it. Each one of these has a little red and a green indicator. That will tell you when the batteries are charged. But there was plenty on the top. You can sort of see the LED there. But there's plenty on the top anyway, so I could see what was happening. That's what it looks like from above. Oh, of course, then I had to get a battery bracket made up. So what I did was, this time I didn't want to weld it myself. I thought, no, I think I'll get this done properly. So I made a cardboard version of this bracket. So this would hold the other end of the motor. The gearbox was holding that up. There was another support here, and then I needed something here. So I made this cardboard bracket, took it into a company in the middle of Adelaide who was a welding fabricator, and he said, can you make me one of these? And he looked at me and went, what are you doing? When I told him, he like, ooh, interesting. So he made that up for me, so that was strong. I told him it needs to handle a fair bit of power and I don't want it to twist. So I made it quite thick, a much better job than I would have done. And then I could sort of see what it was going to look like. And the other problem is things like how do you hold the batteries in? Like the engineer said, each battery has to be held in so it can't wobble around. And so we use these little spacers, which are like a polypropylene plastic. So that's the controller. That was a Soliton 1 controller, again capable of about 1000 amps. I used a pot box, which this is here, it's basically a throttle potentiometer. So instead of having like a throttle body, which you put your foot down on the accelerator and it moves your throttle body, it just moves this, and this sends a signal to the controller and tells it how much energy to put into the electric motor from the batteries. There's a whole bunch of AC and DC wiring. I kept the AC on this side and then the DC on this side. What am I showing here? I had a massive DC circuit breaker here in between the two seats because I wanted to have something that I could switch it off if ever I need to, but also something that's easy to access from the cabin of the car. I didn't want to be opening the boot to turn things on and off. So I just had a big a DC circuit breaker there. That was the big on and off switch. And then I wanted to know kind of like how much battery I'd used. So if I go for a drive for 50 k's, well, what have I got left really? So I got this thing called, what was it called? Can you remember? An Expert Pro, that's it, yes. So I got one of these because it's kind of like a fuel gauge for batteries. And we installed that and I placed it just here underneath sort of where the radio and heater controls are. And the other thing I did was put in here, I had a green light there, and when that turned green, that meant everything was right at the controller, and if you put your foot on the accelerator, the car was going to move forward. But if it was red, it meant that the car wasn't actually on, because obviously you couldn't hear anything. It's not like a normal car where your engine's running. So I just had a few lights and things like that to let you know what was happening. 5-speed manual gearbox, no clutch anymore. And that's really what it looked like when it was finished. That was kind of as neat as I could get it. I really wanted it to look kind of factory. Then took it for a test drive, and yeah, that wheel spinning third gear, even with those fat tyres on it, it had heaps of power. Decided to make the number plate, put it on a hinge and plugged it in from there. And that was the Lotus Elise. I just basically plugged it in, 15 amps, and it would charge up. I'd get around 120 kilometres per charge on it. But at the time I was working in the city and living just around the corner actually from here, doing about 6 kilometres to work and 6 kilometres back. So I could go a week without charging the thing. So I had that, and I really enjoyed driving that around. And I must say, Eric spent many hours helping me with that, many hours soldering and wiring things up. But yeah, that was a really good project. But again, the reason I did it is because General Motors killed the EV1, and I couldn't go into a shop and buy my own car. So I thought, well, I'll build my own. It was then a number of years later that a guy called Bob Lutz talked to the engineers at GM, and they were talking about he wanted to bring out another electric car, and the bigwigs at GM said, no, you will never do an all-electric car again, although they do now with the Bolt. And so they decided to make this car, the Chevy Volt. And earlier this year in January, I took ownership of my Holden Volt. I'd been looking at them for quite some time, but when they came out, they were $60,000, brand new, and I didn't really have the funds for that. I saw one advertised on car sales here in Adelaide at Metro Holden, and they're asking $34,000 for it. And I thought, wow. So I emailed them and I said, would you take 30 grand? And they actually rang me the next day and said yes. And I said, well, I better speak to my wife because I actually haven't got approval yet. So I went to my wife and I said, look, our mortgage wouldn't be that much more if we put 30 grand on it. And fabulous wife that I have, hope that's on the video. She said yes, and I took ownership of this Volt. I was actually living in Queensland at the time, and I hadn't seen it. So much did I want this car that I bought it unseen, and I just said to Metro Holden, I'll send you the money, ship it up to Brisbane. And I had to wait 2 weeks, and it was like waiting for Christmas as a 10-year-old. It came. I absolutely love it. Because I live in the country, I live down south of Meadows, which is about 40-ish k's from here. I kind of need something that does around 200 k's. Sometimes I do 220 kilometres a day. I've got a sister who lives up north. Sometimes I have to go to Taparoo. So I need a car that is electric and will do 200 plus kilometres in a day, and I don't have the funds for a Tesla. So the Volt actually does that for me. I generally get, that's the back seats, it's just a 4-seater car. I generally get around, the worst I've had is about 60 k's on a charge. The best I've had is about 94 k's on one charge. And a lot of it's to do with the hills, whether you get some regen. I come down the freeway and I can regenerate and charge the car as I'm driving along, just by rolling down the hill. I love the displays on it. It's got everything on there, air conditioning, heating, and it just drives really, really well. I love the way that they've actually got your charge door opener here. You push that to open the charge port door, but then hidden up in here, you've got the petrol door cap opener, which is kind of hard to get to. It's like, no, you don't use that. You really don't use that. Better off using the other one instead. So that's my story. I started off hating GM. Now I drive a GM car. But I did say I'd only do it if they brought out an electric one. So it's a shame it doesn't go further. To be honest, I'd love it if it did like 250 k's and it was all electric. But who knows? Tesla 3 is coming out soon, but hopefully it won't be, $80,000. Did anyone have any questions about any of that? Yes, sir. The Elise was sold to a gentleman by the name of Clark, who lives in Victoria. He had a Lotus collection, lucky him, and it's now sitting in his garage as one of his show cars. Yeah. No, it didn't. That's one of the reasons I picked it. I bought that model because it doesn't have power steering. It didn't have air conditioning. There was a whole bunch of things that made it so much easier without having to mess with pulleys. Yeah, what I did was, go to Google, how do you cut into a fuel tank? I filled it up with soapy dishwashing liquid water, got all of the air out of it, and then with it about 3 mils from the top full of water, put an angle grinder in, so there was no chance of it exploding. It was fun. Yeah. Look, I washed it out several times, rinsed it out, and then I put soapy dishwashing liquid water in there. Yeah. Wow. All good. Yeah. Yes. Now there's a problem with that. I had an issue with that. Yes, I did. So yes, they need to be upright. So that was something I was going to mention. Thank you. So in the Elise, when I did the batteries, I think I mentioned that was okay. So when I did the batteries that way, okay. So when I did the batteries that way horizontally, I was coming home from work one day, and all of a sudden, red light came on. What's going on? Anyway, I went out to the back, had a look, and some of the BMS lights on these were on. So the red light, that means there's a problem with the battery or it's too low or something. Whereas all the others that were vertical were green. Anyway, I don't know how I got it back, probably towed back. And I did some research. Eric and I scratched our heads, didn't we, Eric? And we tried to work out what the problem was. And we decided that the issue was the plates in the batteries are going horizontal here, right? And even though the dry cell batteries, there is actually a little bit of fluid in there, just a bit. And if you have it vertical like this, it works and it just flows through the battery. I'm not really technical on this, but what I can tell you is if you have it that way, it doesn't go through all the plates. The fluid doesn't get there and it causes a problem. So even though I'd had it registered and gone through Regency having the batteries this way, I actually had to pull all of this stuff back out again, and then I put them on their side and did it that way. And I couldn't find any photographs of that. I hadn't taken any. But thank you for mentioning that. Yes, good point. The Prius? My wife has a Prius. Oh, the Camry wasn't out then. No, this is back in 2010, 2011. But the Camry wasn't all electric as well. I really wanted, at that time, I wanted an all electric car. And something that I could do a lot of Ks, 70, 80 Ks just on a charge. Yeah. Well, after pulling the clamshell off the front, so you've got the big shell at the back, and there's all this space, well not a lot of space, but it looks like a lot of space. When we pulled the clamshell off the front, because I thought I'll balance the batteries up, there was no room, nothing. Like it was just full of cables and things like that. It really was, there's just no room, so I wasn't able to balance it. But when I weighed it, it only weighed about 70 or 80 kilos more, because that engine would have weighed a fair bit. Plus all the other stuff. And the petrol tank, by the time it had the batteries in, it weighed roughly the same as what it did with a full tank of fuel. So that was negated, that was 10 batteries negated out immediately. Yeah. Oh, the Tesla was unbelievably fast. I mean, I've had fast cars. I've had 4 Porsches, I've had a Maserati. I used to have a really good job and currently unemployed. But I've had a lot of good cars in my time, and the Tesla was outstanding so far. But the Volt, look, if you put it on sports mode, even on normal mode, it's quite zippy. 0 to 100 in around 8.9 seconds. And because you've got that low down instant torque, which just pushes you back in your seat, I'm more than happy with it. All right, well, thank you very much. Cheers.